The wooden platform creaked beneath her boots as rough hands shoved Beatrice Vale forward, her wrists still bound with coarse rope that had rubbed her skin raw during the 3-day journey from Kansas. The afternoon sun blazed mercilessly over Granite, Colorado in the summer of 1878, and sweat trickled down her spine beneath the tattered calico dress that had once been her Sunday best. She could feel hundreds of eyes on her, men's eyes assessing her worth like cattle at market, and the humiliation burned hotter than the August heat. The auctioneer, a pot-bellied man with tobacco-stained teeth, grabbed her shoulder and spun her around to face the crowd gathered in the dusty town square. "Gentlemen, we have here a fine specimen of womanhood, 20 years old, healthy, strong enough for work. Her family's debts need settling, and she comes with papers proving she's agreed to indentured servitude for 5 years to cover what's owed. We'll start the bidding at $50. Beatrice wanted to scream that she had never agreed to anything, that her stepfather had forged her signature after her mother died, that she had woken to find herself bound and gagged in a wagon heading west. But the gag had only been removed an hour ago, and her throat was too parched from thirst to do more than whisper. She scanned the faces before her, seeing greed, lust, indifference, and her heart sank like a stone in a well. $50, called a voice from the left, belonging to a man whose belly hung over his belt and whose breath she could smell from 10 feet away. 60, countered another, this one rail thin with eyes that reminded her of a weasel. The auctioneer's face split into a yellow grin. Now we're getting somewhere. Do I hear 70? Through the haze of fear and exhaustion, Beatrice noticed a figure at the back of the crowd leaning against a hitching post with the easy confidence of a man who owned his place in the world. He was tall, probably in his mid-20s, with dark hair that needed cutting and a face shadowed by a wide-brimmed hat. Unlike the other men jostling for position, he stood perfectly still, watching not the auctioneer, but her, and something in his gaze made her straighten her spine despite everything. 75, someone shouted, and the bidding continued to climb. Beatrice felt dizzy. Whether from the heat or the horror of her situation, she could not tell. Her bound hands trembled, and she tried to work her fingers against the rope. But whoever had tied the knots knew their business well. $100, the fat man called triumphantly, and several of the other bidders groaned and stepped back. $100 was more than many men in this rough mining town made in 3 months. The auctioneer raised his gavel. 100 going once, going twice. 200. The voice cut through the square like a knife through butter, deep and steady and brooking no argument. Every head turned toward the tall cowboy at the back, who pushed off from the hitching post and walked forward with long, measured strides. His boots kicked up small clouds of dust with each step, and Beatrice could see now that he wore a gun belt slung low on his hips, the leather worn smooth from use. The crowd parted for him like the Red Sea, and Beatrice caught sight of a badge pinned to his vest, though it was not the star of a sheriff, but something else, something she could not quite make out. His face, now visible beneath the brim of his hat, was handsome in a weathered way, with strong features and eyes the color of storm clouds. A thin scar ran along his jaw, barely visible beneath a few days' worth of stubble. $200, the auctioneer repeated, his voice pitched higher with excitement. That's a serious bid, Mr. Rourke. Anyone want to go higher? The fat man scowled and shook his head, backing away into the crowd. No one else dared to speak. The cowboy Rourke apparently stepped up onto the platform without waiting for the gavel to fall. He moved with the grace of a mountain cat, and when he reached Beatrice's side, he did something that shocked her to her core. He pulled a knife from his belt, and before the auctioneer could protest or she could flinch away, he sliced through the ropes, binding her wrists in one clean motion. The severed cord fell to the platform with a soft thud, and blood rushed back into her hands, bringing with it 1,000 pinpricks of painful sensation. She gasped and would have stumbled if his hand had not shot out to steady her elbow, his grip firm but surprisingly gentle. No one should be sold like chattel with their hands tied, he said, his voice pitched low enough that only she and the auctioneer could hear. Then, louder, "I'll pay the 200 in gold, but I want those papers drawn up proper as employment papers, not servitude. 5 years of honest work for honest wages, with room and board provided, that's the deal, or I walk. And you can explain to everyone here why you're selling white women like slaves 15 years after the war ended." The auctioneer's face went from red to purple, but he could read the mood of the crowd shifting. Several men were nodding, and one grizzled prospector spat in the dust and muttered, "Man's got a point. This ain't right, treating a girl like she's property." "Fine, fine, Kiev," the auctioneer snapped, snatching the papers from his assistant. "Employment contract it is. Sign here, Mr. Rourke." While the cowboy scrawled his name across the bottom of the document, Beatrice rubbed her wrists, trying to make sense of what had just happened. The man beside her had just spent $200, a small fortune, to buy her contract, had cut her free, and was now insisting on better terms. It made no sense. Men did not do such things without wanting something in return, and she had learned the hard way that what they usually wanted was the one thing she would never willingly give. "Can you walk?" Rourke asked, turning to her with those storm-gray eyes that seemed to see straight through to her bones. "I think so," she managed, her voice coming out as a croak. "I need water." Without a word, he unslung a canteen from his shoulder and handed it to her. She drank greedily, not caring that water spilled down her chin, and the cool liquid was the finest thing she had ever tasted. When she finally lowered the canteen, gasping, he took it back and capped it with economical movements. "My horse is at the livery. Can you make it that far? Or should I carry you?" The thought of being carried through town like a sack of flour brought heat to her cheeks. "I can walk." He nodded once and turned to the auctioneer. "The gold will be at the bank by end of business today. I'm good for it, and everyone here knows it." The auctioneer did not look happy, but he waved them away with a flutter of papers. Rourke placed a hand at the small of Beatrice's back, not pushing, just guiding, and steered her off the platform and through the crowd. Men stepped aside, some tipping their hats, others glaring with resentment at having lost their prize. She kept her eyes fixed on the ground, trying to ignore the stares and whispers that followed them down the main street of granite. The town was typical of mining communities that had sprung up in the Colorado mountains, a collection of wooden buildings thrown up hastily. A few painted, most not, with false fronts to make them look more impressive than they were. The street was unpaved and dusty, lined with a general store, a saloon, a hotel, a blacksmith, and various other establishments. Mountains rose in the distance, their peaks still touched with snow even in August, and the air carried the sharp scent of pine and rock. Beatrice's legs felt like they might give out at any moment, but she forced herself to keep moving. She would not show weakness. Not to this stranger who had paid so much for her, not to anyone. Pride was about all she had left. The livery stable sat at the edge of town, a large barn that smelled of hay and horses and leather. The owner, a bent old man with kind eyes, nodded to Rourke as they entered. "Got your mare all saddled up, just like you asked?" "Obliged, Tom." Rourke led Beatrice past the stalls to where a beautiful chestnut mare stood waiting, her coat gleaming like copper in the shafts of light that pierced through gaps in the barn walls. The horse nickered softly as they approached, and Rourke ran a hand down her neck with obvious affection. "This is Rosie. She's got a gentle disposition, so don't worry." "Where are you taking me?" Beatrice finally found the courage to ask, though her voice shook slightly. He looked at her for a long moment before answering. "My ranch. It's about an hour's ride north of here, up in the valley. You'll have your own room, 3 meals a day, and decent work. I need help with the house and the cooking, and during roundup an extra pair of hands with the herd. Nothing you won't be able to handle once you get your strength back." "Why?" The word burst out of her before she could stop it. "Why did you do that? Why cut the ropes? Why demand better papers? Why pay so much?" His jaw tightened, and for a moment she thought he would not answer. Then he said quietly, "Because 6 years ago, my sister was sold at an auction just like that one, down in Texas. By the time I found out and tracked her down, she'd already—" He stopped, swallowed hard. She'd already taken her own life rather than endure another day of what they'd done to her, so when I heard there was going to be an auction here in Granite, I made sure I had the money to outbid anyone. and I made sure you'd be treated like a human being, not property. That's why." Beatrice felt tears prick her eyes, the first she had allowed herself since this nightmare began. "I am sorry for your loss." He gave a short nod, then turned to swing himself up into the saddle with easy grace. He extended a hand down to her. "Come on, we'll ride double until we get to the ranch, and then we'll figure out getting you a horse of your own if you can ride." "I can ride," she said, accepting his hand. His palm was calloused from hard work, and his fingers closed around hers with surprising warmth. He hauled her up behind him as if she weighed nothing, and she had no choice but to wrap her arms around his waist and hold on as he nudged the mare into motion. They rode out of Granite in silence, following a trail that wound up into the foothills. The afternoon sun painted the landscape in shades of gold and amber, and gradually Beatrice felt some of the tension begin to drain from her body. The rhythmic movement of the horse was soothing, and she could not help but notice that the man she was pressed against smelled of leather and sage and wood smoke, a not unpleasant combination. "I am Beatrice Vale," she said after a while, feeling the need to break the silence. "Though I suppose you knew that from the papers." "Kieran Rourke," he replied, "though most folks call me Rourke. And yes, I knew your name, but it is good to hear you say it yourself. Makes you real, not just words on a page." "What was your sister's name?" she asked softly, then immediately regretted the question. "Forgive me, that was presumptuous." "No, it is fine." His voice was steady, though she felt his shoulders tense slightly beneath her hands. "Her name was Margaret. Maggie, we called her. She was 17, and she had red hair like our mother, and she could sing like an angel. She wanted to be a teacher." They rode on, climbing higher into the mountains, and Beatrice tried to imagine what kind of man would carry such grief and turn it into action. Most men she had known would have drowned their sorrows in whiskey or turned bitter and mean. Kieran Rourke had apparently done neither, and that intrigued her almost as much as it frightened her. The ranch, when they finally reached it, was nestled in a green valley with a creek running through it, surrounded by pine-covered hills. The house was solidly built from logs, larger than she had expected, with a wide porch and real glass windows. A barn stood off to one side, and she could see cattle grazing in the distance, maybe 50 head or so. It was beautiful in a wild, untamed way that made her chest ache with something she could not quite name. Kieran dismounted and helped her down, and she swayed on her feet, exhausted beyond measure. He steadied her again, frowning with concern. "When did you last eat?" "Yesterday morning, I think. Maybe the day before. Time has been strange." His frown deepened. "Come on, let's get you inside and fed before you fall over." The interior of the house was surprisingly well kept for a bachelor's dwelling, with sturdy furniture and colorful woven rugs on the wooden floors. He led her to a chair at a long table and pointed to it. "Sit. Do not move." She sat, too tired to do anything else, and watched as he moved around the kitchen with the efficiency of someone long accustomed to caring for himself. He built up the fire in the stove, set a pot of coffee to brew, and began slicing bread and cheese. Within minutes, he set a plate before her along with a cup of cool water from a bucket. "Eat slowly," he cautioned. "Your stomach will rebel if you go too fast after days without food." She wanted to gobble everything down, but she forced herself to take small bites, chewing carefully. The bread was fresh, probably from town, and the cheese was sharp and creamy. It was simple fare, but it tasted like a feast to her starved body. Kieran sat across from her with his own plate, though she noticed he ate little, mostly just watching to make sure she did not choke or make herself sick. When she finally pushed the plate away, having eaten about half of what he had given her, he nodded approval. "Good. You can have more in a couple hours. For now, let me show you your room so you can rest." He led her up a narrow staircase to the second floor, where there were 3 doors. He opened the one on the left, revealing a small but comfortable bedroom with a real bed, a chest of drawers, a washstand with a basin and pitcher, and even a small mirror on the wall. Clean quilts covered the bed, and white curtains fluttered at the window. "This was meant to be Maggie's room," he said quietly. "I built this house 2 years ago, thinking maybe I could convince her to come stay with me after I got established, but I never got the chance. It has been sitting empty, waiting. Seems fitting that you should have it now." Beatrice turned to look at him, this tall cowboy with sad eyes and a hero's heart, and felt something shift inside her chest. "Thank you," she whispered. "I do not have the words to tell you what this means, but thank you." He tipped his hat to her, a gesture that was oddly formal and touching. "You are welcome, Beatrice Vale. Now rest. We will talk more tomorrow about the work and the arrangements." After he left, closing the door softly behind him, Beatrice stood in the middle of the room for a long moment, hardly daring to believe this was real. Then she kicked off her boots, peeled off her filthy dress, and washed herself as best she could with the water in the pitcher. She found a clean nightgown in the chest of drawers presumably intended for Maggie, and pulled it on before collapsing into the bed. The mattress was stuffed with something soft, and the quilts smelled of lavender, and within seconds she was asleep, falling into darkness like a diver into deep water. She did not dream, or if she did not remember it. When she woke, the room was dark, and for a moment panic seized her. Then memory returned, and with it, the realization that she was safe, at least for now. She lay still, listening to the unfamiliar sounds of the house settling, the distant lowing of cattle, the whisper of wind through pine trees. She must have slept through the rest of the previous day and all through the night, because pale dawn light was beginning to seep through the curtains. Her body ached, and her wrists throbbed where the ropes had cut into her skin, but the bone-deep exhaustion had eased somewhat. Beatrice rose and dressed in her old calico dress again, it was all she had, and made her way downstairs on silent feet. She found Kieran already up, standing at the stove with his back to her, cooking something that smelled heavenly. He had removed his vest and gun belt, and she could see the play of muscles beneath his shirt as he worked. "Good morning," she said softly, not wanting to startle him. He turned, and a smile touched his lips, transforming his face. "Good morning. I was starting to worry you might sleep another day. How do you feel?" "Better. Sore, but better." She moved closer, drawn by the warmth of the stove and the promise of food. "What are you making?" "Eggs and bacon and fried potatoes. Nothing fancy, but it is filling." He glanced at her, then away. "I hope you do not mind my saying this, but you're going to need some new clothes. That dress has seen better days, and you will need something sturdier for work anyway. There's a seamstress in town, Mrs. Chen, who does good work and fair prices. We can go down this afternoon if you're up to it." The thought of going back to Granite, where people had watched her being sold like livestock, made her stomach clench. But she forced herself to nod. "That would be kind of you." They ate breakfast in companionable silence, and Beatrice marveled at how natural it felt to sit across from this man she barely knew. He was not what she had expected. In the stories she had heard, cowboys were rough, crude, given to drinking and fighting. Kieran Rourke seemed different, quiet, thoughtful, with a core of strength that needed no loud demonstration. After the meal, he showed her around the ranch properly. The barn housed not just Rosie, but 2 other horses, a black gelding named Midnight, and a gray mare named Pearl, along with a milk cow, some chickens, and various bits of tack and equipment. He explained that he ran about 60 head of cattle, a small operation compared to some of the big spreads further east, but enough to make a decent living. "I do most of the work myself," he said as they walked along the creek, watching the water tumble over smooth stones. "During a roundup and branding, I hire a couple of hands from town, but otherwise it is just me, which is why having help with the house and the cooking will make a real difference. During busy seasons, I've been living on hardtack and jerky more often than not." "I am a good cook," Beatrice offered, feeling the need to prove her worth. "My mother taught me before she died, and I can sew and mend, do laundry, tend a garden if you have one or want one. I am stronger than I look. I do not doubt it." He studied her with those penetrating gray eyes. Anyone who could stand on that platform yesterday with their head held high is plenty strong. Heat rose to her cheeks at the compliment, and she looked away, focusing on the creek. I did not feel strong. I felt terrified. Being brave is not about not feeling fear. It is about feeling it and standing firm anyway. He picked up a smooth stone and skipped it across a still pool, making it bounce 3 times before it sank. You did not cry or beg or fall apart. That takes strength. They walked back to the house, and Kieran showed her the root cellar, the smokehouse, the vegetable garden that had been sadly neglected and was more weeds than vegetables now. Like I said, I've not been keeping up with everything I should. If you can bring this garden back to life, I would be grateful. Fresh vegetables would be a nice change from beans and salt pork. Beatrice surveyed the tangled mess of weeds and saw the potential beneath. I can do that. It will take time, but I can do it. We have time. He said it simply, but the words carried weight. 5 years, according to the contract, but somehow standing there in the morning sunshine with mountains rising around them and the creek singing its endless song, 5 years did not seem like a prison sentence. It seemed like possibility. They rode into Granite that afternoon, this time with Beatrice mounted on the gentle Pearl while Kieran rode Rosie. The ride down was easier than the climb up had been, and Beatrice found herself relaxing into the rhythm of the horse's gait, remembering the pleasure of riding from her childhood before everything had gone wrong. The town looked different in daylight, less threatening somehow. People stared as they rode down the main street, but Kieran's presence beside her seemed to create a bubble of safety. He nodded to a few people, ignored others, and kept Rosie at a steady walk until they reached a small shop with a sign that read Chen's Tailoring and Dry Goods in neat letters. Inside, the shop was cool and dim, filled with bolts of fabric and the whir of a sewing machine. A woman emerged from the back, small and neat, with gray-streaked black hair pulled into a bun and keen eyes behind wire-rimmed spectacles. She broke into a smile when she saw Kieran. "Mr. Rourke, I heard you made quite the splash at yesterday's auction." Her accent carried the lilt of someone who had learned English as a second language, and her gaze moved to Beatrice with curiosity but no judgment. "And you must be Miss Vale. Welcome to Granite, though I imagine you would have preferred a different sort of welcome." "Thank you, Mrs. Chen," Beatrice said, liking the woman instinctively. "She needs work clothes," Kieran said, getting straight to the point. "At least 3 dresses, something sturdy that will hold up to ranch work. And whatever else women need, I will leave that to your judgment. Send the bill to me." "Mrs." Chen pursed her lips thoughtfully, circling Beatrice with a measuring eye. "Good fabric. Nothing too dear, but nothing that will fall apart in a month. 2 work dresses in dark colors that will not show every stain. 1 nicer dress for town and church. Undergarments. A warm shawl for when the weather turns. A good pair of boots. Yes, I can do this. Come, Miss Vale, let me take your measurements." Kieran retreated to wait outside, and for the next hour Beatrice stood while Mrs. Chen measured and pinned and made notes in a small book. The seamstress worked with quick efficiency, but her manner was kind, and she kept up a steady stream of chatter that required little response. "I came here from San Francisco 10 years ago," she said as she measured Beatrice's waist. "My husband was a miner, thought he would strike it rich. He did not, but we stayed anyway because the town needed a good seamstress, and we made a better living with needle and thread than we ever did with a pickaxe. He passed 3 years ago, but I keep the shop going. It is a good life, in its way." "How do you find living here?" Beatrice asked, genuinely curious. "It seems so isolated." "It is, but that can be good or bad depending on what you make of it. The winters are hard, and sometimes the miners get rowdy when they have been drinking, but mostly people leave me alone and pay their bills. And the mountains are beautiful, if you have an eye for such things." She paused in her measuring to look Beatrice in the eye. "I will tell you something, Miss Vale. What Mr. Rourke did yesterday took courage. There are men in this town who are not happy about it, who think he had no right to interfere in a legal auction. You would be wise to stay close to the ranch and to him for a while until the talk dies down." A chill ran down Beatrice's spine despite the warmth of the shop. Are you saying there might be trouble? I am saying that men who get outbid for something they want can harbor grudges. Most of them are cowards who will do nothing, but it only takes one fool with too much whiskey in him to cause problems. Be careful. That is all I'm saying. Mrs. Chen smiled and patted her arm. But do not worry too much. Mr. Rourke has a good reputation. He is known as fair and honest, and he does not start trouble, but he can finish it if he needs to. You are in good hands. When the measuring was done, Mrs. Chen promised to have at least 2 dresses ready within a week, with the rest to follow shortly after. Kieran paid a deposit in silver coins and escorted Beatrice out to where the horses were tied. Is there anything else you need from town? He asked, as he checked Rosie's cinch. Beatrice thought for a moment. Writing paper and a pen, if it is not too much to ask. I should write to my aunt in Kansas. Let her know I'm all right. She will have heard what my stepfather did by now, and she will be worried. Of course. He led the way to the general store, where a balding man with suspicious eyes watched them from behind the counter. Kieran ignored the man's stare and helped Beatrice select paper, envelopes, ink, and a decent pen. He paid without comment, added a peppermint stick to the order with a small smile, and they left. They were untying the horses when a voice called out behind them, "Rourke, hold up a minute." Beatrice turned to see a man approaching, tall and broad-shouldered, with a sheriff's star pinned to his vest. His face was weathered, and his hair more gray than brown, but his eyes were sharp and assessing. "Sheriff Dawson," Kieran greeted him with a nod. "Something I can do for you?" "Just wanted a word about yesterday's excitement." The sheriff's gaze flicked to Beatrice, then back to Kieran. "That was quite a bid you made." "It was a fair price for honest labor," Kieran replied evenly. "Some folks are saying you made the rest of them look bad, insisting on changing those papers." "Some folks need to look in a mirror and decide what kind of men they want to be." Kieran's tone was mild, but there was steel underneath. "If buying a woman's contract and treating her like a human being makes them uncomfortable, that says more about them than it does about me." The sheriff grunted, but there was a glimmer of approval in his eyes. "Fair enough. Just wanted to make sure there was not going to be any trouble. We run a peaceful town here." "I have no intention of causing trouble, Sheriff. I just want to work my ranch in peace." "Good. See that you do." The sheriff tipped his hat to Beatrice. "Madam, welcome to Granite. I hope you will find it to your liking." After he walked away, Kieran helped Beatrice mount Pearl, then swung up onto Rosie. They rode out of town at a trot, and Beatrice could feel eyes on them from windows and doorways. She was glad when they reached the edge of town and the trail began to climb back up into the hills. "Does the sheriff always question you about your business?" she asked once they were out of earshot. "Only when he thinks there might be trouble. He is a good man, trying to keep order in a place that does not always want to be orderly. I do not fault him for that." Kieran glanced back at her, but Mrs. Chen was right to warn you. Stay close to the ranch for a while. I do not think anyone will actually try anything, but better safe than sorry. The warning should have frightened her, but instead Beatrice felt a strange warmth. This man who barely knew her was willing to stand between her and danger, just as he had stood between her and that auction block. She found herself studying the set of his shoulders, the easy way he sat his horse, the quiet competence in everything he did. They spent the rest of the ride in comfortable silence, and when they reached the ranch, Kieran showed her how to unsaddle Pearl and brush her down properly. His hands moved over the horse's coat with gentle efficiency, and he spoke to the mare in a low voice, praising her for being so patient with her new rider. Over the following days, they fell into a routine. Beatrice rose with the sun and made breakfast while Kieran tended to the livestock. After they ate, he would head out to ride the range, checking fences and moving cattle while she tackled the household chores. She scrubbed floors, washed windows, beat rugs, and slowly brought order to the house. The neglected garden received special attention, and she spent hours on her knees pulling weeds and coaxing the surviving vegetables back to health. In the evenings, they would sit on the porch as the sun set behind the mountains, drinking coffee and talking. Beatrice learned that Kieran was 26, that he had grown up on a ranch in Texas, that he had headed north after Maggie's death because he could not bear to stay in a place with so many painful memories. He had chosen Colorado for its beauty, and relative isolation. Bought the land with money he had saved over years of working various cattle drives, and built everything with his own hands. It was lonely at first, he admitted one evening as they watched the sky turn orange and purple. I am used to solitude, but this was different. This was choosing to be alone because being around people hurt too much. But after a while, the land started to heal something in me. There is peace here, in the quiet and the mountains and the rhythm of the seasons. I can see that, Beatrice said softly. I can feel it too. After everything that happened, I thought I would never feel safe again. But here I do. He turned to look at her, and something in his expression made her breath catch. I am glad. You deserve to feel safe. The moment stretched between them, charged with something neither of them was quite ready to name, and then a coyote howled in the distance, breaking the spell. They both smiled and rose to go inside, but Beatrice lay awake that night thinking about the way he had looked at her and the way her heart had responded. The following week, Mrs. Chen sent word that the dresses were ready, and they rode into town to collect them. Beatrice tried on the work dresses in the shop's back room and was delighted to find they fit perfectly. Sturdy and practical, but with small touches of beauty in the stitching and trim that showed Mrs. Chen's skill. The nicer dress was a soft blue that brought out the color of Beatrice's eyes, with a fitted bodice and a full skirt that rustled when she moved. You look lovely, Mrs. Chen said with satisfaction. That blue suits you. When Beatrice emerged wearing the new dress, Kieran's eyes widened slightly, and he seemed momentarily at a loss for words. It is very nice, he finally managed, his voice rough. Very nice indeed. They stopped at the general store to pick up supplies, and while Kieran was discussing an order with the shopkeeper, a man sidled up to Beatrice. He was one of the men from the auction, the thin one with weasel eyes, and he smelled of whiskey even in the middle of the afternoon. You think you're something special, don't you? He muttered, standing too close. Rourke treating you like a lady instead of what you really are. But we all know the truth. You are no better than a step away from her. Kieran's voice cracked through the store like a whip, and suddenly he was there, inserting himself between Beatrice and the drunk man. Now. The man sneered but took a step back. I was just talking to the lady. She is not interested in conversation with you. Leave, now. Something in Kieran's tone must have penetrated the whiskey haze because the man muttered a curse and stumbled out of the store. Beatrice realized she was shaking, and Kieran gently took her elbow. Are you all right? Did he touch you? No, he just said some vile things. I am fine. But she was not fine. Not really. And Kieran must have seen it in her face because he quickly concluded his business and ushered her out to the horses. They rode home at a faster pace than usual. And once they were back at the ranch, Kieran insisted on making dinner himself while Beatrice sat at the table and tried to calm her racing heart. He put a bowl of stew in front of her and sat down across from her with a serious expression. I am sorry that happened. I should have stayed closer. You cannot protect me from every unpleasant person in the world, Beatrice said, though she was touched by his concern. And you did protect me when it mattered. You always have. Still, it bothers me. He ran a hand through his hair, leaving it sticking up at odd angles. You should not have to deal with men like that. You should be able to walk through town without being harassed. In a perfect world, perhaps, but this is not a perfect world. She reached across the table and without thinking placed her hand over his. Thank you for standing up for me. Again. He looked down at their joined hands, and his fingers curled around hers, warm and strong. You do not have to thank me, Beatrice. It is the right thing to do, and besides, he paused, seeming to struggle with words. Besides, I care about what happens to you more than I probably should, given that you have only been here a couple of weeks. Her heart was beating so hard she was sure he must be able to hear it. I care about what happens to you, too. They sat like that for a long moment, hands clasped across the table, and Beatrice felt something shift and settle inside her, like a key turning in a lock. This man with his scarred jaw and sad eyes and hero's heart had become important to her in ways she was only beginning to understand. As summer waned toward autumn, the days grew shorter and the nights cooler. Beatrice continued to work on the garden, harvesting what vegetables she could and preserving them for winter. She made pickles and jam, dried herbs, and helped Kieran smoke meat from a deer he shot. The root cellar filled with stores, and the house took on the warm smell of cinnamon and apples as she baked pies and tarts. They worked well together, anticipating each other's needs and movements with the ease of long practice. When Kieran brought in 2 ranch hands for the autumn roundup, Beatrice cooked huge meals to feed the hungry men, and she noticed with quiet satisfaction how they praised her cooking and how Kieran's chest seemed to puff with pride. The hired men, both weathered cowboys in their 40s, treated Beatrice with respect, tipping their hats and thanking her politely for every meal. She suspected Kieran had made it very clear how he expected her to be treated, and she was grateful for it. One evening after the hands had ridden back to town, Beatrice and Kieran sat on the porch wrapped in blankets against the autumn chill. The stars were brilliant overhead, undimmed by any town lights, and the Milky Way stretched across the sky like a river of diamonds. "Winter comes hard here," Kieran said, his breath forming small clouds in the cold air. "The snow can be 6 feet deep, and sometimes we get snowed in for days or even weeks at a time. I want to make sure you know what you're facing. If you want to spend the winter in town where there are more people and more shelter, I would understand." Beatrice turned to look at him, surprised and a little hurt. "Do you want me to leave?" "No," he said quickly, urgently. "No, that is not what I meant at all. I just do not want you to feel trapped here when the snow comes. It can be isolating and frightening if you're not used to it." "I would rather be isolated here with you than surrounded by people in town," she said honestly. "This is the first place I have felt like I belong since my mother died. I do not want to leave." His smile was warm enough to chase away the evening chill. "Then you will stay, and we will face the winter together." As if to underscore his words, the first snow came 3 days later, a light dusting that turned the world white and clean. Beatrice stood on the porch and watched the flakes fall, marveling at the beauty of it. Kieran came to stand beside her, and without thinking, she leaned into his warmth. His arm came around her shoulders, and they stood like that, watching the snow transform the landscape. "It is beautiful," she whispered. "It is," he agreed. But when she glanced up, she found he was not looking at the snow. He was looking at her. The kiss, when it came, was as natural as breathing. He bent his head, she tilted her face up, and their lips met in a soft, tentative exploration that sent warmth flooding through her entire body. His hand came up to cup her cheek, gentle and reverent, and she reached up to fist her hand in his shirt, pulling him closer. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, he rested his forehead against hers. "I have wanted to do that for weeks," he admitted. "So have I," she confessed, and they both laughed, giddy with the release of tension. That night marked a turning point in their relationship. They were still careful, still respectful of the boundaries between them, but the air hummed with possibility now. They found excuses to touch a hand on a shoulder, fingers brushing as they passed dishes at the table, sitting close together on the porch in the evenings. Kieran began teaching Beatrice to shoot, reasoning that she should be able to defend herself in the ranch if necessary. She proved to be a quick study, and he praised her steady hand and good eye. They set up targets near the barn and spent hours practicing, his body pressed against her back as he showed her how to aim, both of them acutely aware of the contact. November brought heavier snows, and true to Kieran's warning, they found themselves snowed in for nearly a week after a massive storm dumped 4 feet of white powder over the valley. They spent the days keeping the animals fed and the house warm, and the evenings playing cards and reading aloud from the books on Kieran's shelves. It was during one of those long, snowbound evenings that Kieran told her he loved her. They were sitting by the fire, and she was darning one of his socks while he whittled a piece of wood into some shape only he could see. The declaration came out of nowhere, simple and honest. "I love you, Beatrice." Her hands stilled. the needle poised over the fabric. She looked up to find him watching her with an expression of such tender vulnerability that her heart ached. "I love you too, Kieran. I think I have for a while now." He set down his whittling and crossed to where she sat, kneeling before her and taking her hands in his. "I know we have only known each other a few months, and I know you are supposed to be here working off a contract, but none of that matters to me. What matters is that you have become the most important person in my life. I do not want you here as an employee. I want you here as my wife, if you will have me." Tears spilled down her cheeks, but they were happy tears, tears of relief and joy. "Yes," she whispered. "Yes, I will marry you." He surged up and kissed her, deeper and more passionate than before, and she melted into him, wrapping her arms around his neck. When they finally broke apart, they were both laughing and crying, and he spun her around the room in a clumsy dance that had them both stumbling over furniture. "We will have to wait until we can get to town to find a preacher," he said, still holding her close. "But I want to do this right. I want you to have a proper wedding, with a ring and witnesses and everything you deserve." "I do not need anything fancy," Beatrice assured him. "All I need is you." But Kieran was determined, and when the snow finally melted enough for them to make the trip to Granite, he took her to the general store and let her pick out fabric for a wedding dress. Mrs. Chen was delighted by the news and promised to create something beautiful. The town preacher, a kindly man with a booming voice, agreed to perform the ceremony on the first Sunday in December. The wedding was small but perfect. Mrs. Chen and her daughter attended, along with Sheriff Dawson and his wife, the preacher and his family, and a handful of other townspeople who had come to respect Kieran over the years. Beatrice wore a simple white dress that Mrs. Chen had stitched with tiny flowers along the hem and sleeves, and she carried a bouquet of dried wildflowers. Kieran wore his best suit, his hair slicked back and his jaw freshly shaved, and when Beatrice walked into the small church on Sheriff Dawson's arm, he had offered, and she had accepted, having no father of her own to do the honor, Kieran's face lit up with such joy that several people in the congregation sighed audibly. They spoke their vows in steady voices, promising to love and cherish each other through whatever hardships might come. When the preacher pronounced them husband and wife, Kieran kissed her with such tenderness that Beatrice felt her heart might burst from happiness. The small gathering erupted in applause and cheers, and they were swept into congratulations and well wishes. Mrs. Chen had prepared a wedding supper at her home, and they all crowded into her small dining room to feast on roast chicken and potatoes and carrots with a beautiful cake for dessert. Toasts were made, stories were told, and Beatrice felt embraced by this small community in a way she had never expected. As the evening drew to a close and she and Kieran prepared to ride back to the ranch, Sheriff Dawson pulled Kieran aside for a quiet word. Beatrice could not hear what was said, but she saw Kieran's jaw tighten and his hand move to rest on his gun. The sheriff clapped him on the shoulder, and they shook hands before Kieran returned to her side. "Is everything all right?" she asked as they mounted their horses. "Everything is fine," he assured her, but there was a tension in his shoulders that had not been there before. "Just the sheriff giving me some news. Nothing to worry about tonight." They rode home under a sky brilliant with stars. And when they reached the ranch, Kieran swept her up in his arms and carried her over the threshold, both of them laughing. The house was warm and welcoming, and he set her down gently in front of the fire. "Welcome home, Mrs. Rourke," he said softly. "I like the sound of that," she replied, reaching up to cup his face. "Mrs. Beatrice Rourke." That night, they became husband and wife in every sense of the word, and Beatrice discovered that love could be as tender as it was passionate, as reverent as it was joyful. Kieran treated her like she was something precious and breakable, yet she felt stronger in his arms than she ever had standing alone. In the morning, she woke to find him watching her, propped up on one elbow with a soft smile on his face. "Good morning, wife." "Good morning, husband," she replied, stretching lazily. "What time is it?" "Late enough that we should probably get up and tend to the animals, but I'm finding it hard to move when you look so beautiful in my bed." She laughed and swatted his shoulder. "Flattery will get you nowhere. The chickens need feeding." They rose and dressed, falling back into their routine, but with new layers of intimacy woven through it. He kissed her while she made breakfast, and she rested her hand on his shoulder as he sat to pull on his boots, small touches that spoke of belonging and connection. It was as they were finishing breakfast that a knock came at the door, startling them both. Kieran rose, his hand automatically moving to his gun belt, and crossed to open the door. Sheriff Dawson stood on the porch, his expression grim. "Sorry to disturb you folks, especially the day after your wedding," the sheriff said, "but I have some news you need to hear." Kieran stepped aside to let him in, and Beatrice poured a cup of coffee for their unexpected guest. The sheriff accepted it gratefully and sat at the table with a heavy sigh. "I told you last night that there had been some talk in town," he began, addressing Kieran. "Well, the talk has turned into something more serious. That fellow who bothered your wife in the general store a while back, name of Silas Trent, has been running his mouth about how you cheated him out of what was rightfully his. He has been drinking heavily and making threats." Beatrice felt a chill run through her. What kind of threats? "The kind that involve coming up here and taking what he thinks he's owed," the sheriff said bluntly. "Now, I do not think he has the guts to actually do anything, but I wanted you to be aware. Keep your doors locked and your guns handy. If he shows up here, you send for me immediately." "I can handle Silas Trent," Kieran said quietly, but there was steel in his voice. "I am sure you can, but I would rather it not come to that. We run a lawful town, and I aim to keep it that way." The sheriff finished his coffee and stood. "I will be keeping an eye on Trent, and I have let him know that if he sets one foot on your property, he will be arrested. But you be careful, both of you." After the sheriff left, Kieran paced the kitchen like a caged animal, his jaw tight with anger. Beatrice went to him and placed a hand on his arm, stilling his restless movement. "We will be all right," she said firmly. "We have each other, and we are both armed and know how to shoot. That drunken fool does not stand a chance against us." He looked down at her, and some of the tension eased from his face. "You are right. I just hate that you have to deal with this, that you cannot just enjoy being a newlywed without worrying about some idiot with a grudge." "Life is never perfect," she replied, "but I would rather face imperfect with you than perfect with anyone else." He pulled her into his arms and held her tight, and they stood like that for a long moment, drawing strength from each other. Then he released her with a sigh and went to check all the windows and doors, making sure everything was secure. The days passed without incident, and gradually they began to relax again. December brought more snow and shorter days, and they settled into the rhythms of winter ranching. The cattle huddled together in the pastures, and Kieran had to break ice on the water troughs every morning. Beatrice kept the house warm and prepared hearty meals to sustain them through the cold. One evening as they sat by the fire, Beatrice realized something with a jolt of surprise and joy. She had been feeling off for a few days, and her monthly courses were late. She pressed a hand to her belly, hardly daring to hope, but the signs were all there. "Kieran," she said softly, interrupting his reading, "I think I might be with child." He looked up, the book forgotten in his lap, his eyes wide with wonder. "Are you certain?" "Not completely, but I think so. All the signs point to it." He was across the room in an instant, kneeling before her and placing his hand gently over hers on her belly. "A baby," he breathed. "Our baby." "Are you happy?" she asked, suddenly nervous. It was early in their marriage, and they had not discussed children. "Happy?" He laughed, and it was a sound of pure joy. "Beatrice, I am more than happy. I am overwhelmed, awed, grateful beyond words." He looked up at her with tears shining in his eyes. "You have given me so much already, love, companionship, a reason to smile again, and now a child. It is more than I ever dared to dream." They held each other and made quiet plans, talking about nurseries and names and the future. Kieran insisted she must take things easier, must not overwork herself, and she laughingly agreed to let him fuss over her. The winter passed peacefully, with no sign of Silas Trent or any other trouble. The snow piled high, and they were snowed in more than once, but they did not mind. They had each other and the promise of new life growing between them, and that was enough. As spring began to green the valley and the snow melted into rushing streams, Beatrice's condition became obvious. She bloomed with pregnancy, her skin glowing and her eyes bright. Kieran hovered over her like a mother hen, insisting she rest while he took on more of the household chores. She found his concern endearing, even when it became a bit overbearing. In late April, they made the trip to town to purchase supplies for the coming baby. Mrs. Chen was thrilled by the news and immediately began planning a layette, showing Beatrice soft flannel and delicate lace. The whole town seemed to have embraced them as one of their own, and people stopped to congratulate them and offer advice. It was as they were loading their purchases into the wagon that trouble finally found them. Silas Trent staggered out of the saloon, clearly drunk, even though it was barely past noon. His eyes locked onto Beatrice and his face twisted with hatred. "There she is," he slurred, pointing an unsteady finger. "The whore who thinks she is too good for the rest of us." Kieran moved to stand between them, his face like stone. "Walk away, Trent. You do not want to do this." "Do not tell me what I want," Trent spat. "You think you are so much better than everyone else, with your high and mighty ways? Well, you are not. And she is just a—" He did not get to finish the sentence. Kieran's fist connected with his jaw with a crack that echoed down the street, and Trent went down like a felled tree. He lay in the dust, groaning as Sheriff Dawson came running from his office. "What happened here?" the sheriff demanded, though his tone suggested he already knew. "Trent was drunk and threatening my wife," Kieran said evenly, rubbing his knuckles. "I defended her honor." Several townspeople had gathered, and they all nodded in agreement, confirming Kieran's version of events. The sheriff sighed and hauled Trent to his feet, slapping handcuffs on him. "That is it, Trent. You are going to jail to dry out, and then you are leaving town. I am done with your troublemaking." He looked at Kieran and Beatrice. "You folks all right?" "We are fine," Beatrice assured him, though she was shaking slightly. Kieran put his arm around her, steadying her. "Good. Get on home, and do not worry about this fool anymore. I will make sure he is on the next stage out of here." They drove home in silence, both processing what had happened. When they reached the ranch, Kieran helped Beatrice down from the wagon with extra care. "I am sorry you had to see that," he said quietly. "Do not apologize. You were defending me just as you always have." She took his sore hand in hers and kissed the bruised knuckles gently. "I am proud to be your wife, Kieran Rourke. I am proud of the man you are." He pulled her close, careful of her swollen belly, and they stood like that in the yard as the sun set behind the mountains, painting the sky in shades of gold and rose. The baby came in early June, on a morning bright with sunshine and birdsong. Beatrice had been having pains through the night, and as they intensified, Kieran rode to town at breakneck speed to fetch Mrs. Chen, who had offered to serve as midwife. The older woman arrived with her daughter and took charge immediately, shooing Kieran out of the bedroom and setting about preparing for the birth. The labor was long and hard, and more than once Kieran tried to burst into the room, unable to bear hearing Beatrice's cries of pain. Mrs. Chen's daughter had to physically block the door and reassure him that everything was progressing normally. Finally, as the sun reached its zenith, a baby's cry rang out, strong and healthy. Kieran nearly broke down the door in his haste to get inside, and he found Beatrice exhausted but smiling, cradling a red-faced infant wrapped in soft blankets. "It is a boy," she said softly, tears streaming down her face. We have a son." Kieran approached the bed as if walking on sacred ground, his eyes fixed on the tiny bundle in her arms. When he reached them, he gently touched the baby's downy head with one finger, his expression one of absolute wonder. "He is perfect," he whispered. "You are both perfect." They named him Michael after Kieran's father, with the middle name Thomas after Beatrice's mother's father. Little Michael Rourke had his mother's blue eyes and a shock of dark hair like his father, and from the first moment he owned both of his parents' hearts completely. The months that followed were a blur of sleepless nights and first smiles, of learning to be parents together and marveling at every small milestone. Michael was a good baby, healthy and happy, and he thrived on the ranch. Beatrice would carry him in a sling as she tended the garden, and Kieran would take him out to the barn to see the horses, holding his tiny son with infinite gentleness. As Michael grew from infant to toddler, the ranch prospered. Kieran expanded the herd and hired more permanent help, two brothers from Wyoming who proved to be hard workers and good company. The house rang with laughter and the sounds of a child at play, and Beatrice could hardly remember the terrified girl who had stood on that auction platform 4 years ago. When Michael was 2 years old, Beatrice discovered she was pregnant again. This time the baby came in February during a blizzard, and Mrs. Chen was snowed in at the ranch for a week. The birth was easier than the first, and they welcomed a daughter into the world. They named her Margaret Rose, after Kieran's lost sister and Beatrice's mother, and the baby girl seemed to bring healing to old wounds. Michael was delighted with his baby sister and appointed himself her protector, toddling after his mother whenever she carried the baby and patting Margaret's head with chubby hands. Kieran would sit with both children in his lap, reading to them or singing old cowboy songs, and Beatrice would watch from the doorway, her heart so full she thought it might burst. The years flowed past like water in the creek, each season bringing its own joys and challenges. They added 2 more children to their family, another son they named Daniel, and then a second daughter, Claire. The house that had once echoed with emptiness now rang with the chaos and laughter of 4 children, and Kieran and Beatrice navigated parenthood together with patience and love. Granite grew and changed over the years. The mines played out and some people moved on, but others stayed and built new lives. The town acquired a proper school, and Beatrice served on the board, determined that her children and all the children of the valley would have access to education. Mrs. Chen became a beloved grandmother figure to the Rourke children, teaching them to sew and telling them stories of faraway China. On their 10th wedding anniversary, Kieran took Beatrice back to the spot where he had first brought her after the auction, the place where he had cut her bonds and offered her freedom. They stood hand in hand, looking out over the valley that had become their home, and reflected on the journey that had brought them here. "I never imagined my life could be like this," Beatrice said softly. "When I stood on that platform, I thought my life was over. I thought I had lost everything." "Instead, everything was just beginning," Kieran replied, pulling her close. "That was the day my life truly started, when I saw you standing there so brave and so alone. I knew I had to save you, but I did not know you would be the one to save me." "We saved each other," she corrected, rising on her toes to kiss him. "And we built something beautiful together." They returned to the house to find their children had prepared a surprise celebration with help from the ranch hands, a feast laid out on the long table, and handmade decorations strung across the room. Michael, now 12 and tall like his father, presented them with a wooden plaque he had carved himself, bearing the words, "The Rourke Ranch Founded on Love, 1878. As they sat down to eat, surrounded by their children and friends, Beatrice caught Kieran's eye across the table. He smiled at her, that same warm smile that had first melted her heart, and raised his glass in a silent toast. She raised hers in return, acknowledging all they had built and all they had overcome. The years continued to pass, bringing both joys and sorrows as years do. They lost Mrs. Chen to old age when Claire was 10, and the whole town mourned the loss of the kind seamstress who had befriended so many. They weathered drought and harsh winters, cattle diseases, and economic hardships, but they faced everything together, their love and partnership only growing stronger with time. Michael grew into a fine young man who shared his father's love of ranching, and he took over more and more of the daily operations as Kieran's hair turned gray. Margaret proved to have her mother's head for business and began keeping the ranch accounts, improving their profits with her careful management. Daniel became a teacher, inspired by his mother's passion for education, and Claire, the baby of the family, surprised them all by announcing she wanted to study medicine. On a golden September afternoon, 25 years after that fateful auction, Kieran and Beatrice sat on their porch watching the sunset as they had done countless times before. They were both in their late 40s now, showing the wear of hard work and good living, but their hands were still clasped together as tightly as ever. "Do you ever regret it?" Kieran asked suddenly. "Marrying me, staying here, building this life?" Beatrice looked at him in surprise. "Regret? Never. Not for a single moment. Why would you ask such a thing?" "I just want to make sure you are happy," he said. "That you have been happy all these years." She turned in her chair to face him fully, taking both his hands in hers. "Kieran Rourke, you are the best thing that ever happened to me. You gave me freedom when I was bound, safety when I was threatened, love when I thought I would never know it. You gave me a home and a family and a purpose. How could I possibly regret any of that?" "I love you," he said simply, as he had said 1,000 times before and would say 1,000 times more. "I love you too," she replied, the words as true now as they had been that first time she spoke them. Always and forever. As the sun dipped below the mountains and the first stars began to appear, they sat together in peaceful silence, two souls who had found each other against all odds and built something lasting and true. The house behind them glowed with lamplight, and they could hear the sounds of their grown children inside, laughing and talking, carrying on the legacy of love that had begun with a cowboy's courage and a woman's resilience. Years later, when they were both old and gray, sitting in the same chairs on the same porch, their grandchildren playing in the yard, Beatrice would sometimes think back to that August day in 1878. She would remember the fear, the humiliation, the despair, and then she would remember the sound of a knife cutting through rope, the feel of circulation returning to her hands, and the sight of a tall cowboy standing before her with determination in his eyes. Kieran had outbid everyone that day, offering more than just money. He had offered respect, dignity, and ultimately love. He had cut her bonds and set her free, never knowing that in doing so, he would bind their hearts together forever. They lived out their days on the ranch they had built together, surrounded by children and grandchildren, secure in the knowledge that they had created something good and lasting. When Kieran finally passed at the age of 76 with Beatrice holding his hand, his last words were, "Best $200 I ever spent." Beatrice lived another 5 years, remaining active and sharp until the end. She spent her final years writing down the story of their life together, wanting their descendants to know how it had all begun with an auction and a cowboy and a woman who had refused to give up hope. On her last day, surrounded by her children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren, she smiled and closed her eyes, ready to join her beloved husband. Her final words echoed his, "Best day of my life." They were buried side by side on a hill overlooking the valley with a simple headstone that read, "Kieran and Beatrice Rourke, united by courage, bound by love." And the ranch they had built with their own hands continued on, passed down through the generations, a testament to what can grow from seeds of kindness planted in desperate soil. The story of the cowboy who cut the ropes and outbid everyone became part of local legend, told and retold in granite and beyond, inspiring others to acts of courage and compassion. And though the players in that drama eventually returned to dust, the love they had shared lived on, echoing through the years like a song that would never fade. In the end, their story was proof that even in the darkest moments when hope seems lost and the future looks bleak, salvation can come from unexpected places. Sometimes it comes in the form of a stranger with a kind heart and a willingness to stand against injustice. Sometimes it comes wrapped in courage and conviction and the simple belief that every human being deserves dignity and respect. And sometimes, if we are very lucky, it comes with love, the kind of love that transforms lives, builds legacies, and reminds us all that we are capable of far more goodness than we often believe. The kind of love that begins when a cowboy cuts a woman's bonds and declares that no one should be sold like property, and that ends only when the last person who remembers the story has told it one final time to eager ears. The Rourke Ranch still stands today, operated by the sixth generation of that family, and visitors who come to see the historic homestead always ask about the painting that hangs in the front room. It shows a young woman standing on a platform with her hands bound and a tall cowboy stepping forward with a knife in his hand and determination in his eyes. Beneath the painting, a brass plaque reads, August 15th, 1878, the day everything changed. And so the story lives on, a reminder that love can bloom in the most unlikely places, that courage comes in many forms, and that sometimes the best things in life begin with a simple act of human kindness. Kieran Rourke had walked into that town square planning only to prevent an injustice, but he had walked away with the love of his life. And Beatrice Vale, who had thought her life was ending, had instead found it was just beginning. Their love story became the foundation on which an entire family was built. And through that family, countless others were touched and changed and inspired. It was a love born of hardship and watered with tears, but it grew strong and true, providing shelter and sustenance for all who came after. And in the end, is that not what the best love stories do? They remind us of our capacity for goodness. They inspire us to be better than we are. And they prove that even when the world seems dark and hope seems lost, love can light the way forward. All it takes is one person willing to step up, cut the ropes that bind, and declare that there is a better way. Kieran Rourke was that person for Beatrice Vale, and together they created a legacy that would outlast them both, a testament to the power of love, courage, and the unshakable belief in human dignity. Their story is not just one of romance, but of redemption, of two broken people finding wholeness in each other, of darkness transformed into light. And that, perhaps, is the greatest love story of all.